My stepdad left me alone in the hospital while he went on vacation. What happened next will shock you. CPS got involved after my mom's lies were exposed. I wish I could say I was shocked, but honestly, this was just another chapter in the long, miserable saga of my life since Randy walked through the door. The man is a walking red flag. A self-absorbed control freak nightmare who somehow convinced my mother that he was an upgrade from my dad. Spoiler alert, he was not. 3 years ago my parents' marriage fell apart. No surprise there. They never saw eye to eye. My dad worked hard to provide while my mother, well, let's just say she was more interested in building her brand than building a home. She called herself an influencer, but in reality she spent more time taking selfies and hunting for discount Botox deals than actually taking care of me. Cooking? Hated it. Cleaning? Never did it. Helping me with homework? Pfft. As far as she was concerned, I was an accessory. Something to be groomed and dressed up for her carefully curated online persona. After the divorce, my time was split between my parents. Took some getting used to, but I was finally adjusting when Mom met Randy. And just like that, my world turned upside down again. From their very first date, my mother was obsessed. Within weeks, she forced me to meet him. I knew from the second I shook his sweaty, overconfident hand that this guy was trouble. He wasn't just a stepfather, he was a dictator. Randy had a vision for our new family, and guess what? I wasn't part of it. He had 2 sons from a previous marriage, 2 spoiled, loud, entitled brats who thought bullying me was their God-given right. They barged into my room, took my stuff without asking, and treated me like an outsider in my own home. And Randy? He encouraged it. He saw me as a problem, a liability, something to control. He criticized everything I did, from the way I talked to the way I dressed. According to him, I was too sensitive, too girly, and too independent. And my mother? She let it happen. I wanted to live with my dad, but he had to move for work. We still talked all the time and he knew things weren't great at Mom's, but he didn't know just how bad they really were. Then came the accident. Mom and I were out shopping for our upcoming family vacation. A rare event since Randy usually made it clear I wasn't part of the fun. But this time I was actually included. For the first time in forever, I thought maybe things were looking up. I should have known better. On our way home, a car slammed into us from behind. The impact wasn't life-threatening, but it was bad. I ended up with a broken arm and a concussion. Mom got a few bruises and scrapes, but nothing serious. The ambulance took us to the hospital, and that's where the real betrayal began. Randy showed up an hour later. He walked in looking concerned, but it took about 3 minutes before he started complaining. About the vacation, about the money they'd spent, about how this whole thing was so inconvenient for him. When the doctor told me I'd have to stay in the hospital for observation due to my concussion, Randy's face twisted like he'd just bitten into a rotten lemon. He wasn't worried about me. He was pissed that I was ruining the trip. Mom, to her credit, hesitated. She said she should stay with me. Randy shut that down fast. We already paid for the tickets, he said, like that was the most important thing. She'll be fine. Hospitals have staff for this kind of thing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You're just gonna leave me here? Alone? You're 15, Randy said, like that explained everything. It's just a couple of days. I turned to my mom, desperate for her to stand up for me. He didn't. She stayed one night, but the next morning, Randy showed up with her suitcase in hand, ready to drag her to the airport. I pleaded, I begged. She looked guilty. But not guilty enough. And just like that, they were gone. For the first time in my life, I truly understood what it meant to be abandoned. A nurse found me crying that night. She offered to call my mom. I told her not to bother. I knew she wouldn't pick up. Instead, I gave her my dad's number. I braced myself for disappointment, for him to say something like, "It's not that bad," or, "Just wait till they get back." But when he answered and the nurse explained what had happened, I heard something I hadn't in a long time, real concern. And then something else. Pure, seething rage. "She what?" he growled. I told him everything. Every detail. The way Randy had dismissed me, the way my mother had caved, the way they'd left me alone in a hospital bed because their vacation was more important than their own daughter. My dad went silent. But I could feel the anger radiating through the phone. "She told me it was just a fender bender," he finally said, voice tight. "Said you were fine. Never mentioned the hospital. Never mentioned a broken arm." I felt like throwing up. Not only had my mother abandoned me, she had lied to my father to cover it up. Dad took a breath, then another. When he spoke again, his voice was calm. Deadly calm. I'm on my way. For the first time since the accident, I felt like someone actually gave a damn. And I knew, when my father got here, everything was about to change. My dad arrived at the hospital in record time. When he walked through the door, he didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, looked at my bandaged arm, my tired face, the dried tears on my cheeks. And then he did something I hadn't expected. He hugged me. Not a quick, awkward dad hug. A real one. Strong. Proactive. The kind that made me feel safe for the first time in years. Then he pulled back, sat down beside my bed and said, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about the accident, about Randy's reaction, about how my mother had let him convince her to leave me behind. I told him about all the years of neglect, the favoritism, the way I'd always felt like an afterthought in my own home. Dad listened. He didn't interrupt. He just sat there absorbing every word. But the whole time I could see his jaw clenching, his fists tightening. He was furious. When I finished, he took a deep breath, pulled out his phone and called my mother. She didn't pick up. He called again. Nothing. Then he tried Randy. Straight to voicemail. I could practically see the steam coming out of his ears. "They knew," he muttered. "They knew you'd tell me the truth." Dad stood up. "All right. Here's what's gonna happen. You're coming with me. I don't care what custody arrangement we have. You are not staying with them." Relief flooded through me so fast I almost cried. But then doubt crept in. "Can you do that?" I asked. "Legally, I mean." He exhaled sharply. "Watch me." The moment I was discharged, Dad took me straight to his place. He didn't waste any time. He got in touch with his lawyer the next morning. And then he called Child Protective Services. I had no idea what to expect from CPS. I worried they wouldn't take it seriously. But the moment Dad explained what had happened, how my own mother had abandoned me in a hospital while I was injured, well, let's just say they were very interested. That was the moment everything started to shift. CPS launched an official investigation. They called my mother and Randy in for questioning. They interviewed me. They even visited our house. And suddenly my mother, who had ignored all my calls and texts since leaving, was very interested in talking to me again. When she finally called, I let it go to voicemail. I didn't need to hear her excuses. But then she texted me. "We need to talk. Please don't do this." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. Not "I'm sorry." Not "I messed up." Just "don't do this." Like I was the one tearing our family apart. I showed the text to Dad. He shook his head. Typical. Then came another message. "You're making a mistake. CPS could take you away from me forever." I felt a strange mix of anger and disbelief. Was that supposed to be a threat or a plea? I didn't respond. Instead, I let Dad handle it. He sent one text back. "She's staying with me. Permanently. Don't contact her unless it's to apologize." Mom didn't reply. But I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I should have known peace wouldn't last. 3 days after CPS got involved, Randy showed up at my dad's house. I was in the kitchen when I heard a loud knock. No pounding on the front door. My dad opened it and there he was, standing in our doorway like he owned the place. Randy's face was twisted in anger, his fists clenched at his sides. "We need to talk," he growled, shoving his way inside. Dad didn't budge. He stepped in front of him, his face calm but his stance firm. "You need to leave. Now." "Where is she?" Randy barked, his eyes scanning the room. "We're taking her back home. This little stunt of yours has gone far enough." I stepped forward, my heart hammering in my chest. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Randy's head snapped toward me, his glare so intense I felt my stomach tighten. "You're acting like a spoiled brat, making a scene, dragging CPS into family business. You have no idea what you're doing." Dad let out a dark chuckle. "Oh, she knows exactly what she's doing, telling the truth. Which is more than I can say for you or my ex-wife." Randy scoffed. "This is your fault. You're poisoning her against us." I clenched my fist. "You left me alone in a hospital, Randy. That's your fault." His face darkened, but Dad stepped between us before he could say another word. "You heard her. She's not going anywhere with you. Now, if you don't get off my property, I'll make sure the cops escort you." Randy's jaw tightened. For a second, I thought he might actually take a swing at my dad. But then his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, read something, and his scowl deepened. Without another word, he turned and stormed out the door, slamming it behind him. I exhaled, my hands still shaking. Dad put a hand on my shoulder. He won't be back. Not if he knows what's good for him. But I wasn't so sure. That night, my phone buzzed with a call from my mother. I ignored it. Then came the text. What did you say to CPS? You're destroying this family. Do you even care what you're doing to me? To Randy? I stared at the screen, my chest tightening with rage. Not a single text asking if I was okay. If I needed anything. If I felt safe. I typed back. You destroyed this family when you left me in a hospital. I'm done. I hit send and turned off my phone. This wasn't over. But I wasn't scared anymore. I was ready for whatever came next. The silence didn't last long. 2 days after Randy's dramatic exit, Mom showed up. I wasn't expecting her, but when I heard the knock on the door, softer than Randy's but just as insistent, I knew. Dad answered, blocking the entrance like a bodyguard. What do you want? I need to talk to her, Mom said, her voice strained as if she had spent the entire morning rehearsing her lines. Alone. Dad turned to me. Your call. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face. The other part wanted answers. 5 minutes, I said, stepping outside onto the porch. Mom's eyes flickered with relief, but she kept her distance. I didn't know Randy was going to show up like that. I crossed my arms. That's what you're opening with? Not, I'm sorry. Not, I messed up? She swallowed hard. I'm sorry. But this has gotten out of hand. CPS is involved and they're looking at our family like we're some kind of criminals. Do you have any idea what this could do to us? Like we were still a unit. You did this, I shot back. You left me. You lied to Dad. You let Randy treat me like garbage. I'm done, Mom. I'm not coming back. Her face fell, her eyes darting to the window where she knew Dad was watching. You can't just leave. We're your family. I scoffed. When was the last time you acted like my family? She didn't answer. For the first time in my life, I saw her for what she really was. Not the glamorous, self-obsessed influencer, not the fun-loving woman she pretended to be online, but a scared, selfish person who was more concerned about her image than her own daughter. CPS is watching, Mom. If you actually want to fix this, you need to prove it. Not to me, to them. To yourself. Her lips trembled, but she nodded. I'll fix it. I didn't believe her. But I didn't need to anymore. As I turned to go back inside, she reached out, barely brushing my arm. I love you, you know. I met her gaze. Then act like it. And with that, I shut the door between us. Inside, Dad was waiting. You okay? I nodded. Yeah. I think I finally am. This wasn't over. But for the first time, I knew who I was fighting for. Me. For a few days, the silence was deafening. No calls, no texts. Just an eerie calm that made me feel like the storm hadn't passed. It was just circling back around. Then it hit. A letter. Delivered by a courier. Dad opened it first, his jaw tightening as he skimmed the contents. She's trying to fight for custody. I felt my stomach drop. What? After everything? Dad let out a dry chuckle void of humor. She claims you were manipulated into staying here. You're confused. That I coached you into calling CPS. I scoffed. That's insane. You didn't tell me to do anything. I called because she left me in a hospital. I know that. And CPS knows that. But she's desperate. And desperate people do stupid things. Anger simmered under my skin. After everything she had done, after abandoning me, lying and choosing Randy over me, she had the audacity to act like I was the problem? We fight it, I said, my voice steady. I'm not going back. Dad nodded. Then we fight. The next week was a blur of meetings. Lawyers, CPS agents, even a court-appointed counselor. I told my story again and again, every detail, every feeling, every moment of neglect. And then came the day of the hearing. I walked into the courthouse, my hands clammy but my resolve solid. Mom was already there, sitting beside her lawyer, looking polished, composed, and completely full of it. When she saw me, she gave a small, sad smile, like she was the victim. Like she was the one suffering. I ignored it. The hearing wasn't long. I spoke. Dad spoke. CPS presented their findings. And then Mom took the stand. I love my daughter, she said, her voice shaking. I made a mistake, but I was under so much pressure. Randy and we were just trying to hold things together. I never meant to hurt her. I clenched my fist. Never meant to hurt me. Every choice she made had cut me deeper than she'd ever know. The judge listened, nodded, and then finally gave the ruling. Full custody to my dad. The second the words left the judge's mouth, I felt the weight lift off me. It was over. I was free. Mom looked like she wanted to cry. Maybe she finally realized what she'd lost. But I didn't feel sorry for her. She did this to herself. As I walked out of the courtroom, Dad put a hand on my shoulder. You okay? I took a deep breath, then smiled. Yeah. I think I finally am. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't scared of what came next. Because whatever it was, I was walking into it on my terms.